The English word Advent comes from a Latin word, adventus, which means simply arrival or coming. It's what happens when somebody shows up, somebody who is expected. And so then, of course, Advent is the season in which we anticipate Jesus' arrival. Not just at Christmas, but really at various times. Throughout history, the church has celebrated Advent not only as a preparation for Christmas, but also as a way of preparing ourselves for any future return, any other time or way in which Jesus might show up among us. Some theologians talk about the ways in which Advent is a season where we prepare to meet Jesus in history, in mystery, and in majesty. And what they mean by that is in history that we prepare for what it was like and how the Bible talks about the arrival of Jesus in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. In mystery, we contemplate the ways in which Christian faith says that Jesus is still present among us, still active in the world, still influencing our lives. And in majesty, we talk about a future that's yet to come. Whatever that's going to look like or however that's going to transpire, the idea of preparing to meet Jesus in majesty means that we know the world is not perfect. We know that God might have other plans for the world, that the world in which we live in doesn't match God's desire for a just world and for a kind world. And so we expect God to continue to show up among us in a variety of ways. All of that makes Advent a really important season. It's the season where we prepare to meet our God. It's a season in which we recognize that God pledges to show up and to be among us in a variety of ways. One way of looking at Christian faith is to recognize that it's an Advent religion from start to finish. What do I mean by that is Advent is the season of expectation. It's an expectation about God showing up and showing up again and showing up again. And so when I say that Christianity is an Advent religion, what I mean by that is we always live in this seam or the cusp between promises and fulfillment. We recognize that God has shown up, that God has proven true to promises that extend way back into the Older Testament as well as in the New Testament. And we recognize that that past activity of God lays a foundation for hope into the future. And so as Christians, we're always talking about things that have happened in the past, but also things that we yet hope for, things that we expect to come into being. All of that means that the season of Advent every December is an opportunity to reflect on that, to acknowledge the ways in which God has kept promises and to expect that God will continue to do so into our future. The voices that we encounter in the Bible during Advent and the voices that we will explore in all 4 sessions of this study are voices that are fueled by hope. And in many ways, Christianity is a religion that is motivated by hope, that is infused with hope. And hope doesn't just mean I really wish something would happen, like I hope that someday my favorite football team wins the Super Bowl. Hope is born out of confidence. It's born out of a sense of the reliability. And in this case, that reliability rests with God, that God is the one who is reliable because God has proven reliable in the past. And so Advent is a kind of expectant hope, a kind of confident hope, but it's also an active hope. It's a hope that calls us to be ready, that calls us to participate in the kinds of things God does to set the world to rights. As we walk into Advent, and as we begin with things that Jesus says about our future and about his future, we're reminded that Advent is not so much about anticipating holidays or events. Advent is formed around the expectation of meeting a person. In other words, the focus of Advent is Jesus himself. The focus of Advent are the ways in which Jesus promises to show up among us. One of the ways we talk about how Jesus will be present among us is to look at some of the ways in which the Bible has conceived of that. And to understand the way the Bible conceives of that, we need to understand at least 2 Greek words. One of those Greek words is parousia, which is a reference to Jesus' future arrival. That word parousia is very similar to the Latin word Advent in terms of how it means an arrival. It means coming. It means showing up. Traditionally, Christians have spoken about the parousia, or the coming of Jesus, in terms of a second coming or a future arrival. And different Christian groups have interpreted that in a variety of ways, whether somebody expects Jesus to show up in the clouds, or you expect Jesus to be manifest in the world in a variety of ways, or really a whole range of other possibilities. It's important to notice that the ways in which the New Testament talks about that future parousia, that future arrival, is also tied up into how we think about Advent. In other words, Jesus does not just come once 2,000 years ago, but we expect Jesus to be present in the world and to bring all things to fruition. To help make better sense of the things that Jesus says about his own future parousia, or his own future arrival, we need to know something about the ways in which people in Jesus' day thought about God and thought about their theology. One of the ways in which Jews during the first century conceptualized God and the world and their struggles was through a kind of literature that we refer to as apocalyptic literature. And that word apocalyptic in English sometimes brings up images of mass destruction and of warfare, but in reality that word apocalyptic just means, at its most basic level, revelatory, or an unveiling, a discovery of something that was previously hidden. There's a variety of apocalypses, of different kinds of literature that Jews were writing and reading in the ancient world that described things about God being in charge of human history, that talked about the ways in which a different reality was possible and was indeed about to break in, that talked about resurrection, that talked about an afterlife. That kind of literature seems to have been an influence on Jesus' own ways of teaching and the ways in which he prepared his followers to imagine what his ministry was about and what kind of future they could expect. And so in Matthew and Mark and in Luke, when Jesus embarks on this long speech where he's asked about the destruction of the temple, and he talks about various future calamities that are going to occur, and he culminates this speech with a promise of his own return, we need to realize that what he's talking about there is fueled by, is sparked by, his own exposure to apocalyptic imagery, to apocalyptic ways of conceptualizing how God is committed to breaking into this world, that God is not content to sit at some kind of safe distance from the world, but that God will indeed break into this world to set things to rights. In a way, that's what we celebrate at Christmas. And Christmas is a manifestation of God's own commitment to be among us. And it's also what we celebrate, or what we anticipate, when we think about how God will bring things to completion. It's interesting to begin Advent with these voices, or more specifically with the voice of Jesus talking about an uncertain future, a difficult future, and then the final culmination of all things. One of the things that's important to note about this part of the Gospels and what Jesus has to say is it underscores the reliability of God. Jesus tries to reinforce the idea that God is reliable, that God will not leave the world to its own decay. The second thing that's worth noting is that Jesus doesn't promise to remake the world into a perfect place. The crucifixion doesn't change the world into a world where there's no more pain or suffering. And so in many ways, it's a kind of realistic assessment of what life in this world is like. The third thing to notice is that Jesus also talks about the role of his followers during an uncertain future. And that role is to be involved, is to bear witness to God's goodness and the reliability of God in the things that we say and in the ways in which we live. And then the fourth thing to realize about this speech from Jesus and the way in which his voice resonates, not just now, but throughout Advent, is that he never really talks about what's on the other side. He never talks about a kind of perfect future to come. Rather, he talks about his own presence, or his own arrival, or his own commitment to us. In other words, we don't get images of streets of gold or tables filled with plenty of food. We get a promise for Jesus to be among us. And what that looks like, where that takes us, that's where imagination comes in. The language he uses is probably not meant to be taken absolutely literally. It's meant to fire our imaginations and to recognize that whatever is next, or whatever the future holds, it's an entirely different kind of reality, but one in which God is among us.